Imagine walking down the street, minding your own business and being stopped by the police. Not because you did anything wrong, but simply because of how you look. How would that feel? In today's story, we follow Malcolm Hayes, a young black man in Chicago who faces this exact reality every day. But what happens when the man constantly watched and scrutinized by the system is actually in charge of it all? What if he's the one pulling the strings behind the scenes? In The Man They Watched, Malcolm's journey takes a dramatic turn when he steps into a government hearing, not as a suspect, but as the Director of National Intelligence, challenging a system built on racial profiling and injustice. Get ready for a story that will make you rethink everything you know about power, identity, and standing up for what's right. But before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that challenges the status quo. And as you watch, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think of Malcolm's fight for justice. Now let's get into it. Disclaimer. The story you are about to watch is entirely fictional and is intended for motivational, inspirational, and educational purposes. While the characters and events are products of creative imagination, the themes explored, including justice, identity, and the challenges of systemic inequality, reflect real issues that many people face today. The narrative is designed to encourage reflection, provoke thought, and offer moral lessons. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Thank you for watching, and we hope this story inspires you to think critically, challenge the status quo, and always strive for justice and equality in your own life. The Man They Watched is the gripping story of Malcolm Hayes, a young black man in Chicago who is constantly stopped and harassed by the police simply because of his appearance. These routine encounters seem to follow him wherever he goes, until one day, he walks into a room full of government officials and introduces himself as the Director of National Intelligence. What follows is a powerful tale of identity, justice, and the fight against systemic oppression. As Malcolm confronts a deeply flawed system that uses racial profiling and surveillance to control marginalized communities, he exposes the hidden truths that others would rather keep buried. With courage, determination, and an unwavering belief in justice, Malcolm fights not just for his own dignity, but for the very soul of a nation. The Man They Watched is a story of resilience, leadership, and the transformative power of speaking truth to power. The sun had not yet burned off the cold from the streets of Chicago's South Side. Morning light stretched long across cracked sidewalks and graffiti-stained brick walls. Malcolm Hayes stepped out of his modest two-story home dressed in a gray hoodie, fitted jeans, and sneakers with soles worn thin from years of walking more than riding. He zipped his hoodie up just beneath his chin, slipped his phone into his back pocket, and started the familiar walk toward the train. A pair of teens across the street waved to him as they rode past on their bikes. He nodded, offering a quiet smile. He knew both their names, knew which schools they hated, which ones they dreamed of going to, and which uncles were already caught up in things they shouldn't be. Malcolm had been mentoring boys like them since he was 19. Now, at 32, the habit hadn't faded, no matter how busy his other life became. The streets were slow this morning. An elderly man swept the sidewalk in front of the corner store. The air smelled of car exhaust, dew, and something fried and oversalted from the 24-hour takeout joint near the bus stop. Malcolm walked with calm purpose, neither rushing nor dawdling. He was on time as always. As he neared the Jackson and Pulaski intersection, a familiar sound cut the air. A short chirp from behind, then a longer one. He didn't need to turn to know what it was. Still, he stopped, turned slowly, and faced the patrol car that had pulled over just yards behind him. Two uniformed officers stepped out. One of them, white, mid-30s, his hand resting near his holster, called out, "Yo, come here a second." Malcolm raised his eyebrows but didn't speak. He walked back toward the officers, calm, hands visible, fingers open. The other officer, black, younger, stood behind his partner with his arms crossed. "Where you headed?" the first officer asked. "Train station. Going downtown," Malcolm said. "Mind if we see some ID?" He paused. Not in defiance, but in restraint. He knew his answer didn't matter. He pulled his wallet from his pocket and handed over his state ID. "Just checking. There's been a string of break-ins a few blocks from here," the officer explained. "You match the description." Malcolm nodded once. "Right," he said. The younger officer shifted, glanced at Malcolm's ID, then passed it back to his partner. He squinted. "Malcolm Hayes," he read aloud. "That name familiar?" The other shrugged. Malcolm took the ID back when it was handed over and tucked it neatly into his wallet. "No apology. No thank you. Just that same casual suspicion." "All right," the officer said. "Stay out of trouble." Malcolm walked away. The platform was nearly empty when he arrived. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, watching as pigeons flapped overhead and wind from the tracks below stirred loose candy wrappers. A woman waiting nearby glanced at him, then pulled her purse closer to her chest. He watched the city with quiet precision, like someone studying patterns no one else could see. Faces passed by him every day, but few ever really looked at his. He was used to that. It made his job easier. The train door slid open and he stepped inside, heading toward a seat near the back. He pulled out his phone and opened an encrypted messaging app. A single message awaited him, timestamped just 5 minutes earlier. Briefing confirmed. Police headquarters, 1,400 hours. You will be introduced as planned. Malcolm read it once, then deleted it. Downtown Chicago, with its polished towers and mirrored windows, offered a different rhythm than the South Side. Here, suits passed each other in tense silence. Coffee shops buzzed with deals and debates. He moved through it like a man who belonged and did not belong all at once. He walked past City Hall, turned down a side street, and entered a plain office building. Inside, glass elevators hummed upward. Malcolm scanned his badge at a discreet security gate, then took the elevator to the 10th floor. The doors opened into a modern, unmarked space filled with screens, encrypted lines, and people who spoke rarely and never loudly. A man in a sharp navy suit stood near a conference room table. He nodded as Malcolm approached. "You're early," the man said. "I always am," Malcolm replied. "Everything's on schedule. The interagency meeting is locked. The press still doesn't know who the new director is. Not officially, anyway." "Good," Malcolm said, removing his hoodie and folding it over the back of a chair. Beneath it, he wore a clean black button-up. Simple, crisp. It didn't need a tie. "Your call to host it at CPD headquarters caught a few folks off guard," the man added. "They thought you'd want something federal." "I wanted Chicago," Malcolm said. "It matters that I'm seen there. That they see me." The man nodded, but his eyes flicked away. He didn't ask for explanation. No one in that room needed one. Malcolm sat, opened a file, and began to review the national security briefing he would deliver in just a few hours, to the very department whose officers had stopped him that morning for simply walking while being a black man from the South Side. Outside the glass, the city moved unaware. But a shift was coming. And Malcolm Hayes would not let them look away anymore. The air inside Chicago Police Headquarters was colder than the spring day outside. Not in temperature, but in tone. The marble floors gleamed with unnatural perfection. Portraits of former commissioners and medal recipients lined the walls of the main hallway, all dressed in blue, all white, staring stoically from gold-rimmed frames. Malcolm Hayes entered the building alone through the main entrance. He wore the same black shirt from earlier and a charcoal gray blazer. No lapel pin. No badge displayed. Nothing flashy. Just Malcolm, moving quietly yet confidently past the front desk. A young receptionist barely looked up before stopping him. "Sir, can I help you?" she asked. "Yes. I'm expected," Malcolm said. "Name?" "Malcolm Hayes." The woman typed, then looked confused. She stood and gestured for a nearby uniformed officer. "Could you assist Mr. Hayes? There's no record of an appointment under that name." The officer, a tall man with a shaved head, approached, sizing Malcolm up quickly. It was the same scan Malcolm had seen his entire life. Head to toe. Skin to clothes. Purpose to presence. "ID?" the officer asked. Malcolm calmly reached into his inner jacket pocket and removed a sleek black folder. It bore no logo, no seal. Just weight and leather. He opened it and handed the officer a card. The officer studied it, eyebrows rising slowly. His grip on the folder tightened. I'll call the chief's office," the officer said. "No need," Malcolm replied, retrieving the folder. "They're expecting me in briefing room 3. But I'll wait." The officer turned quickly and whispered something into a shoulder mic. Moments later, a man in a dark blue suit emerged from a side hallway. His nameplate read Deputy Chief or Harris. He walked with the kind of authority people had to obey before they understood why. "Mr. Hayes," Harris said, extending a hand. "Apologies for the delay. Right this way." No apology from the receptionist. No nod from the officer. Just confusion. Malcolm followed Harris down a narrow hallway, past doors marked Internal Affairs and Tactical Operations. Each step echoed. When they reached briefing room 3, Harris opened the door to a space filled with officials. Men and women from federal agencies, senior detectives, regional Homeland Security liaisons. Everyone was seated except for the podium at the front, waiting for the meeting's lead. Harris stepped forward and cleared his throat. Everyone, he began, thank you for assembling on short notice. We are honored today to be joined by the recently appointed Director of National Intelligence. Please welcome Director Malcolm Hayes. There was a pause. Not from disbelief. From recalibration. Heads turned. Some eyebrows lifted. One man at the back of the room straightened abruptly. Another looked down, pretending to adjust his notes. Malcolm could feel the tension gather like smoke before a fire. But he didn't flinch. He walked to the podium, slow and deliberate, eyes forward. He took a sip of water, set his folder down, and looked across the room. Thank you, he said. Let's begin. He started with the technicals. Cyber threats. Foreign surveillance. Shifts in disinformation campaigns targeting Midwestern elections. The room leaned in. They listened closely, scribbled notes, nodded in agreement. But 10 minutes in, Malcolm closed the folder. He let the silence sit for a second. There's one more threat I need to speak about, he said. No one reached for a pen. Everyone just looked at him. This threat isn't foreign. It's domestic. And it's one we've failed to assess for too long. It doesn't come from overseas or through digital backdoors. It comes from the way we see. Or rather, fail to see. He paused, letting the words fall into the room like stones in water. This morning I was stopped. Again. Walking through the South Side. No probable cause. No courtesy. No apology. The officers did what they've been trained to do. Profile, question, contain. I gave them no resistance. I never do. I've learned not to. He raised his eyes to meet the crowd. Statistically, a black man walking alone in Chicago is more likely to be seen as a suspect than a citizen. More likely to be asked for ID than asked how his day is. That's not a data point. That's a design flaw. And that flaw costs us, not just trust, but effectiveness. A woman near the front, in a tan blazer with an FBI badge clipped to her belt, lowered her head. We train our intelligence officers to see patterns. To detect bias, distortion, irregularity. Yet we rarely train our domestic agencies to see the same patterns within their own procedures. He picked up his folder and tapped it once on the podium. This, he said, is a threat file. It doesn't contain foreign operatives or encrypted messages. It contains incident reports. From Chicago. Filed under Stop and Question. 68% of them involved black men. 40% involved no arrest or charge. Most ended without documentation of any kind. Just data shadows. But people remember what happened in those shadows. He stepped away from the podium. I know I was watched for years. I never resisted. I never ran. I memorized badge numbers. I learned patterns. And in doing so, I became the threat no one saw coming. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I believed we could build something better. He scanned the room again. Still no sound. This briefing is concluded, he said. But our work isn't. As he exited the room, Malcolm felt the stares behind him. Some from admiration, some from guilt, others from the slow unwinding of assumption. The door shut behind him with a soft click. Outside the conference room, Deputy Chief Harris stood waiting. I didn't know, he said. Malcolm nodded once. I know you didn't, he said. That's the point. Later that evening, the South Side streets buzzed under a sky bruised with clouds and the dull orange glow of streetlights. Children chased each other around crumbling curbs. Music pulsed low from passing cars. In this part of Chicago, life went on regardless of meetings in glass buildings or titles on embossed cards. And yet, the weight of what happened at police headquarters began to ripple, quietly and invisibly, like smoke curling through cracks in a wall. Malcolm Hayes sat inside a small community center on 79th Street. The building had once been a library, long since gutted and reborn with second-hand chairs, mismatched paint, and a projector that flickered every third frame. It was Tuesday night, which meant community mentoring. Not speeches. Not lectures. Just presence. He sat across from Jaden Thomas, age 13, who wore a hoodie 2 sizes too big and clutched a notebook like it was a shield. Malcolm leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. You said last week you wanted to write about what makes you angry, Malcolm said. Jaden looked down. I changed my mind. That's all right, Malcolm said gently. You can write about what makes you quiet too. Jaden didn't respond, but the grip on the notebook loosened slightly. Across the room, a girl worked on a collage with old magazine cutouts. Another kid played chess in the corner, silently mouthing every move before placing each piece. Malcolm watched them for a moment, his thoughts drifting. He had seen too many intelligence files filled with children's names. Not because they were threats, but because someone mistook their skin for danger. And that mistake kept repeating. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. A secured message. Meeting requested. Back lot. No. He slid the phone away and stood slowly. "I'll be back," he told Jaden. The boy nodded without looking up. Behind the center, the alley was damp and dimly lit. Steam coiled from vents near the wall. Malcolm stepped out cautiously, his eyes adjusting quickly. A black SUV idled near the back gate. The driver's door opened. Out stepped Special Agent Eliza Quinn. She wore a long coat, one hand tucked into the pocket, the other holding a small folder. "You shouldn't be here," Malcolm said quietly. "And yet I am," Eliza replied. She handed him the folder. Then, "No label. Someone's looking into you," she said. "Not just the usual media background checks. This is deeper. Traces came through a private contractor connected to an old security firm out of Virginia. Off the books." Malcolm opened the folder. A surveillance photo sat on top, grainy but unmistakable. It was him. Yesterday. Walking into his apartment. "You're being tracked," Eliza added. He flipped through the rest. Notes on his habits. Grocery receipts. Phone pings. Nothing illegal. Everything unsettling. "Internal or external?" Malcolm asked. "We don't know yet," she said. "But someone wants to discredit you. Or worse, maybe it's pushback. Maybe someone didn't like what you said at headquarters." Malcolm closed the folder and breathed slowly. "I'm not backing down," he said. "I figured you'd say that." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card. A name and address scribbled on it. "This guy works on the digital side of the contract firm. Quiet. Might talk. But you'll need to go alone. No federal trail. Too risky." Malcolm nodded. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "You know what you're doing scares people," she said. "I know," he said. "It's supposed to." She left without another word, the SUV gliding silently into the darkness. Back inside the center, Jaden was gone. The chairs had been stacked. The lights dimmed. Malcolm sat for a moment beneath a wall covered with photographs. Kids who had passed through the program over the last 10 years. Some were smiling. Some had moved on. A few were gone. He closed his eyes, then stood and left. As he walked the cracked sidewalk back toward his apartment, he noticed it again. The feeling. Subtle. Like being watched not by a person but by an idea. Suspicion doesn't need eyes. It lives in the air, in the unspoken silence behind a pulled curtain or the sudden hush of footsteps behind him. He turned onto his block and stopped. A black sedan sat across the street, lights off, engine quiet. He didn't flinch. He walked slowly to his front steps, unlocked the door and entered. Upstairs he opened the folder again. Every photo, every note, every timestamp. He laid them out on the kitchen table like puzzle pieces. He studied them not for what they said but for what they implied. Someone was coming for him. But they didn't understand one thing. Malcolm Hayes had spent his whole life being watched. Now he was watching back. The next morning in Bronzeville, the sun barely cleared the rooftops before Malcolm Hayes was out the door. The folded card from Eliza Quinn burned in his pocket like a lit match. The name on it was unfamiliar. Carter Sloan. The address led to an abandoned brick building on the west side of the neighborhood, just far enough from downtown to be invisible, but close enough to feel the city breathing. The building looked like nothing. Boarded windows. Faded graffiti. A sagging chain-link fence. But Malcolm knew better. He had seen hundreds of locations like this in field reports. Cloaks of disuse that hid whispers of movement. He knocked 3 times on the side door, paused, then knocked twice more. The pattern was simple. And intentional. No answer. He waited. The door clicked open. A pale, wiry man with sleep-deprived eyes peered out, a cigarette dangling from his lip and a tablet in his hand. Carter Sloan wore 2 mismatched socks and a vintage hoodie with frayed cuffs. He looked more like a college dropout than a digital mercenary. "You're either a cop," Carter said, squinting, "or exactly who I was warned about." Malcolm didn't answer. He just held up the folder Eliza had given him. Carter groaned. "All right. Fine. Come in." But no guns, no wires, and no speeches about ethics. Inside, the room smelled of soldering fumes and cheap coffee. Screens blinked from all angles, showing surveillance feeds, code strings, satellite loops, and one curious window open to a chess game paused mid-check. Carter flopped into a chair and gestured for Malcolm to sit. "You know they'll come after me just for talking to you," Carter said, pulling up a console. "They already are," Malcolm replied. "You're not as invisible as you think." Carter grinned. "Flattered." The room went silent except for the soft tapping of keys. They used a blind IP trail through 2 Dutch proxies and 1 in Bolivia, Carter explained. It looked clean, but the pattern was too perfect. That's how I knew it was government adjacent. No one else cleans up that well. He leaned back and cracked his neck. Someone higher than local PD? Someone with access to federal frameworks but trying to avoid a signature. My guess? Private black contracts out of Arlington. Not officially tied to Langley or Quantico. But they subcontract for both. He pulled up an image on the screen. This is who signed off on the initial data scrape. He goes by the alias Lockridge. Ex-military. Runs a boutique surveillance shop that specializes in preemptive profiling. That's a fancy way of saying they watch people they think might become a problem. Malcolm studied the image. Grainy. Bald head. Broad shoulders. A scar across the left cheek. What does he know about me? Malcolm asked. Enough to be afraid of you, Carter said. He paused. And afraid of what you're about to reveal. Carter pushed a flash drive across the desk. I shouldn't be giving you this, he said. But I've been watching too. I saw the video. The one from headquarters. You stood there and made them listen. That matters. Malcolm picked up the drive. It was wrapped in black tape with a single word scrawled on it, Echo. What's on it? Files, Carter said. Records of internal communications, surveillance logs, predictive reports targeting young black males in urban areas. It's algorithm-based. Cool. No human review. The system flags potential instability markers based on things like clothing color, walking speed, even the number of missed father figures in census data. He looked down, almost ashamed. I helped build that model. Years ago. I thought it would help reduce crime. It didn't. It just changed the face of suspicion. Malcolm tucked the drive into his inner jacket pocket. You ever think about walking away? Carter asked. Every day, Malcolm said. And every day I don't. Later that afternoon, Malcolm sat alone in his apartment, blinds drawn, the flash drive plugged into a secure laptop with no wireless connection. He clicked through folder after folder, each worse than the last. One report outlined a predictive deployment strategy in Chicago that shifted police patrols based not on active crime, but on zip code-generated behavior models. These models used a mix of public and private data, school attendance, social media activity, utility bills, to assign probability scores to neighborhoods. Neighborhoods like Malcolm's. He scrolled down to a report dated 6 years prior. His name was in it. Subject ID, 0049M Hayes. Behavioral consistency, high. Deviance probability, elevated. Profile, monitor only. He read it twice. He remembered that year. It was the same year he'd been followed to the library 3 nights in a row by a squad car that never stopped but always passed slowly. He leaned back and closed his eyes. This wasn't surveillance. This was design. A system meant not to detect danger, but to decide who counted as dangerous before they ever spoke. He reopened the last file. A memo. Internal. Anonymous. If Director Hayes continues to speak openly, shift to strategy B, discredit through credible doubt. Expose vulnerabilities. Push public optics. No direct engagement unless authorized. Malcolm stared at it for a long time. Then he disconnected the drive. He knew what came next. If the truth was buried beneath fear, someone had to unearth it. He would be that someone. Even if it meant the system turned every eye, every hand, and every silence against him. Because now he wasn't the one being watched. He was the one revealing the watchers. Saturday came with a heavy sky that never quite broke open. The air was thick with the kind of tension that cities feel in their bones but rarely name. In Malcolm Hayes' neighborhood, that tension pulsed beneath everyday movements. A mother ushering her son into the barbershop faster than usual, a corner store clerk locking up 5 minutes early, a trio of teenagers suddenly silent when a cruiser rolled by. Word traveled quietly. Malcolm had seen it happen before. Not through the news but through glances. Through the subtle shift in how people walked past him. Some with reverence. Some with fear. Some still unsure. But none of them unaware. He stepped out of his apartment wearing a dark gray coat, collar turned up. The flash drive was no longer in his pocket. It had been delivered to a secure contact in DC the night before, hand-to-hand, no digital trail. But the ripple it would cause, that was already moving. He headed east on foot, passing the mural of Gwendolyn Brooks on King Drive. Eyes followed him. Older men sipping coffee on porches nodded. A group of kids playing basketball stopped briefly, the ball bouncing alone on the pavement. One of them, a boy barely 10, spoke without looking directly at him. "My cousin said you work for the government." Malcolm slowed. "I do." "You the police?" "No," Malcolm replied. "I watch the people who watch." The boy nodded as if that made perfect sense, then passed the ball and ran off. Malcolm kept walking. His destination was the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Pavilion, a modest, sunlit building that hosted city hall forums and town meetings. Today, a panel discussion on civil liberties had been arranged last minute. The invite came from Reverend Thomas Miller, a longtime activist whose voice had never gone soft. Even after losing 2 sons to the same street, he still preached on. Inside, folding chairs lined the hall. A makeshift podium had been set up beside a projector screen. Community leaders, educators, off-duty cops, and concerned residents filled the space. Some came for answers. Some came to be seen. A few came to record. Malcolm took the back entrance and waited behind the curtain. His name hadn't been announced. There was no press release. Just a plan, quiet, deliberate, and unshakably clear. He stepped onto the stage as Reverend Miller introduced the topic. The chatter stilled. "I want to introduce someone who don't usually walk into rooms like this with a badge on his chest or a title in his mouth," Reverend Miller said. "But when he speaks, I suggest you listen. Not because of who he is, but because of what he knows." Malcolm stood in front of the microphone. He took a breath. "My name is Malcolm Hayes," he began, "and I serve as the Director of National Intelligence." Gasps whispered through the crowd like wind cutting through leaves. Phones tilted up. Some hands reached to clap, hesitated, then rested in laps. Malcolm's voice remained even. "I'm here because silence makes systems stronger. Because data is not just information, it is power. And in the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. Not a bullet. A boundary. A prison made of math." He held up a sheet of paper. No screens. No tech. Just one page. "This is a copy of a behavioral surveillance directive," he continued. "One that categorized certain neighborhoods, including this one, as high risk not because of crime but because of color. Because of poverty. Because of statistical shadows." He let the paper fall to the table beside him. "No law was broken to make this document. But that doesn't make it right. And I'm here to say this. I'm not going to wait for change. I'm going to expose what's hidden. With evidence. With names. With accountability." A few claps now. Tentative but growing. One man near the front stood. A retired cop. "And what happens when they come for you?" he asked, not unkindly. "They already have," Malcolm said. He stepped back from the podium. The room burst into conversation, some applause, some concern, some heated whispers. Reverend Miller leaned in. "You know you just lit a fire, don't you?" Malcolm nodded. "Now they have to face the smoke." That evening, he walked back through the neighborhood alone. A group of teenagers trailed him from half a block away, not menacingly, just curious. One of them ran up to him. "You really the top guy?" the boy asked. Malcolm paused. "What do you think?" "I think they don't like when people like you get to be the top guy." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Neither do they." The boy nodded slowly. "Then I guess you better stay loud." He ran back to his friends who scattered like wind through alleyways. Later that night, in a parking garage beneath an office building downtown, 2 men met in silence. One wore a dark trench coat. The other, a navy blue suit with a silver tie clip and a scar across his cheek. "Hayes just blew the cover off our model," said the one in the coat. The man with the scar lit a cigarette. "Then it's time for phase 2. Do we engage?" "No, not yet. Let him burn himself first." They turned and walked away. But what they didn't know was that the parking garage cameras, long believed broken, had just been repaired. And someone else had been watching. The sun hadn't yet risen over Chicago when Malcolm Hayes opened his eyes. Sleep had come in fragments. Thoughts ran like headlines in his mind, surveillance memos, hollow justifications, the hollow stares of agents who once worked beside him, the noise of a system grown too used to its own power. He poured coffee, black and silent, and watched the street below through the blinds. A black sedan had been parked across the road since midnight. Standard issue. No markings. Tinted windows. They weren't even trying to hide anymore. His phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. It was a message. A known. "Back in trance. You have 5 minutes." Malcolm stared at it. No sender. No signature. Just clarity. He grabbed his jacket, left the coffee steaming on the counter, and slipped out the fire escape. A narrow alleyway behind his building led to the next block, where a delivery van idled. Its side panel read Midwest Linen Services. A woman leaned against it, leather jacket, gray scarf, eyes like cut glass. "Eliza Quinn," Malcolm said. "Not quite invisible," she replied. "But I do all right." He climbed into the back of the van. Inside were 2 monitors, a satellite uplink case, and a map of Chicago covered in red pins. "This is the full grid," she said, pointing to the map. Carter pulled every predictive policing node in the metro network. "We found overlap with black site data trails, covert arrests, temporary detentions, unexplained surveillance requests. Most of them focus on men between 16 and 40. 86% black." Malcolm stared at the pins. "They're not protecting neighborhoods," he said. "They're preemptively managing them." Quinn handed him a dossier. "We intercepted new instructions from Lockridge's team. They're going after your legitimacy now. Leaked medical reports. Fabricated psychological profiles. Old footage. Anything to fracture public trust." Malcolm nodded slowly. "And when that fails?" Quinn was silent for a beat. "They moved to elimination." He didn't flinch. Later that day, Malcolm stood outside a courthouse on South State Street. Cameras lined the sidewalk. Reporters pressed forward. He had called the press conference himself. No official channel. No agency clearance. He wore no pin. No title on his lapel. Just a plain dark suit and the weight of what he carried. "I know you've been told to fear me," he began. "To doubt me. To wonder why someone like me could possibly hold the position I do. That's not a flaw in the system. That is the system." He held up a thin envelope. "This is a list of blacklisted individuals who were monitored, detained, or denied clearance not for anything they did, but for what they looked like. For who their families were. For where they prayed or which block they grew up on." He handed the envelope to a local journalist, one who had grown up 5 blocks from Malcolm's own school. "There's a line they drew. Quietly. With numbers. With algorithms. That line runs through every neighborhood like mine, dividing what they consider normal from what they consider dangerous." Pause. "Well, today I'm drawing a different line." He looked directly at the cameras. "A line between truth and silence. Between power and accountability. I'm not here to tear down the agencies I serve. I'm here to remind them who they serve. Because justice that only protects some of us is not justice. It's control." He stepped away as questions shouted from every angle. He didn't answer any of them. He didn't need to. That evening, the story hit every major outlet. But more importantly, it hit the local ones first. The community papers. The student-run blogs. The live streamers with 10,000 loyal followers and no corporate funding. Because Malcolm knew the real battle wasn't in DC. It was here. On sidewalks where stop and frisk wasn't policy but practice. On buses where eyes narrowed when black teenagers boarded. In classrooms where certain names earned lower expectations before a pencil touched paper. At nightfall, as Malcolm returned home, the sedan across the street was gone. In its place was a man in a gray coat, standing under a streetlight. Lockridge. No weapons drawn. Just presence. Malcolm crossed the street slowly. "You sent the memo?" he said. "I wrote it," Lockridge replied. "You watched me since I was 21. We watch threats." "And who decides who's a threat?" Malcolm asked. Lockridge said nothing. "You ever look at someone like me and just see a citizen?" Malcolm asked again. "Not my job to see," Lockridge replied. "Just to act." Malcolm nodded once. "That's the problem." And then he turned and walked away. 2 blocks away, Quinn watched the entire exchange from a rooftop. Beside her, Carter Sloan spoke softly. "He's not afraid." Quinn exhaled. "That's what terrifies them the most." Monday morning arrived beneath a slate-gray sky that pressed heavy on Chicago. Outside the federal building on Dearborn Street, a crowd had gathered. Not in protest. Not in anger. But in presence. Teachers, postal workers, students, retired factory men in worn boots. Journalists elbowed their way through. Street musicians stopped playing. Shopkeepers closed early. They weren't there to see a politician. They were there to witness a reckoning. Inside, security buzzed with tension. Secret Service agents manned every entrance, their movements sharp, eyes trained. The Director of National Intelligence was scheduled to speak before the Congressional Oversight Committee, convened in a rare emergency session outside of Washington. The choice to hold the session in Chicago had been Malcolm's. He wanted them to see where the lines had been drawn. The hearing chamber was packed with officials, aides, and invited guests. Every seat was taken. Cameras mounted in the corners streamed live. Senators whispered behind hands. Representatives reviewed talking points and waited for a misstep. The chairwoman called the session to order. Malcolm Hayes entered without fanfare. No entourage. No flag pin. Just a folder under one arm and calm eyes that scanned the room without pause. He took his seat at the center of the room, the table meant for testimony. One of the senators cleared his throat. Director Hayes, we've summoned you here to address concerns about the misuse of national intelligence resources, particularly in regard to predictive policing models and unauthorized surveillance of American citizens. Malcolm nodded. Understood. The senator continued. Your recent public statements have caused significant disruption within the intelligence community. Do you deny authorizing the release of classified documents? I do not deny it, Malcolm said. I declassified those documents under executive order. Every page I released followed the law. What was done with them afterward, that's what you should be asking about. A murmur swept the room. The chairwoman leaned forward. Director Hayes, you are accusing members of this government of violating civil liberties. You've exposed operational models. You've named contracted defense firms. You've placed yourself at odds with the agencies you lead. Why? Malcolm didn't raise his voice. Because I was never supposed to sit at this table. Silence settled like dust. Men like me are trained to follow, he said. To rise just high enough to look respectable but not dangerous. I was supposed to be grateful, polished, quiet. But when I looked at the files they handed me, files that used zip codes as proxies for race, files that treated teenage boys like pre-convicted criminals, I saw my face. I saw my brother's face. My students. My neighbors. I saw a system that called itself neutral while hiding the ink on its hands. He opened the folder. These are the signatures of field agents who objected to the system and were reassigned, demoted, or quietly terminated. 37 people. Silenced. Not because they were wrong, but because they wouldn't stay blind. A senator interrupted. You're suggesting that institutional bias is embedded in our national security infrastructure? I'm not suggesting it, Malcolm replied. I'm proving it. He placed a data drive on the table. The files on this drive were verified by independent analysts, cleared through internal review, and time-stamped by the Federal Audit Division. They show predictive surveillance being applied to entire communities based on social media patterns, school attendance records, and public housing locations. None of it required warrants. All of it was legal. But none of it was just. The chairwoman adjusted her glasses. And what would you have us do? Malcolm stood. You don't need another reform panel. You need to dismantle the belief that proximity to poverty equals danger. You need to stop outsourcing morality to machines. You need to remember that security built on fear is not security. It's quiet tyranny. He stepped back from the table. I don't want your apology. I want your vote. I want you to pass the community accountability provision. I want oversight on surveillance protocols. I want transparency made public, not buried beneath bureaucracy. And I want you to know, if you don't act, I will. The room froze. For a moment, the officials said nothing. Then one voice spoke from the back. A woman. Senator Mina Rodriguez from New Mexico. Latina, first-generation veteran of both war and politics. I move that we accept Director Hayes' data as evidence and schedule a full investigative hearing. The chairwoman looked around. Silence. Then slow nods. The gavel struck the wood. Motion carried. Outside, the crowd erupted when the doors opened. Malcolm stood at the top of the courthouse steps. Reporters surged. But he didn't speak. Not yet. A little girl standing with her mother near the barricade raised a cardboard sign. Handwritten, crooked letters. You made it to the table. Malcolm saw it. He gave a small nod. And then he stepped down, one stair at a time, not above them, but among them. The seat at the table was never meant to be a throne. It was meant to be shared. The end. Here are 7 moral lessons drawn from the man they watched. 1. Do not let others define your worth based on your appearance. Malcolm Hayes was repeatedly judged, profiled, and mistreated because of the color of his skin and the way he looked. He faced suspicion not because of anything he did, but because of the assumptions others placed upon him. This story reminds us that external judgment, especially based on race, class, or appearance, should never define a person's value. Your dignity, intelligence, and purpose are not determined by stereotypes. In life, people will see what they expect, not what is real, unless you persist in showing them. Malcolm's quiet resistance and eventual triumph show that even in a world determined to misunderstand you, your inner strength, integrity, and excellence can still shine through. This is a call to affirm your identity, especially when the world tries to erase or reduce it. 2. True power is the ability to lead without seeking revenge. Malcolm had every opportunity to retaliate. He could have used his authority to disgrace those who wronged him, the officers who harassed him, the agents who surveilled him, the officials who questioned his competence. But he didn't. Instead, he used his power to illuminate injustice, not to punish individuals but to reform systems. That takes more strength than vengeance ever will. The lesson here is that true leadership is not about settling scores. It's about transforming structures. When we gain power, the temptation is often to wield it as a weapon. But the greatest form of power is restraint, using your influence to uplift, to correct, and to heal, even when you have every reason to do otherwise. 3. Justice that only protects some is not justice. It is control. This line, spoken by Malcolm in the story, underscores a hard truth about how many systems operate, not to protect the vulnerable but to maintain control over them. Justice must be impartial, consistent, and accessible to all. If it only serves the privileged or protects those who already hold power, then it isn't justice at all. It becomes a mechanism of exclusion and fear. This story reminds us to question systems that claim to be neutral but deliver unequal outcomes. Whether in law enforcement, education, healthcare, or politics, we must ask, who benefits and who is left behind? Because justice, if it does not apply equally, is merely a tool of dominance. 4. Silence can be complicity, but truth is always a risk worth taking. Throughout the story, Malcolm could have stayed silent. It would have been safer, easier. He could have remained invisible within the machinery of government. But he chose to speak. And in doing so, he risked his career, his safety, and his reputation. But silence, when faced with systemic harm, is a form of complicity. Truth-telling is often dangerous, especially when it exposes deeply embedded structures. But this story teaches us that the cost of silence is higher than the cost of truth. Speaking up may not win you applause, but it may win justice for those who cannot speak for themselves. And that is always worth the risk. 5. Representation matters, not just as symbols but as decision makers. Malcolm's position as Director of National Intelligence wasn't just symbolic. It mattered. His lived experience gave him insight that others ignored or dismissed. When someone from a marginalized background rises to a position of power, it isn't about filling quotas. It's about bringing voices to the table that have historically been silenced. The story reminds us that when leadership doesn't reflect the people it serves, blind spots become dangerous. Representation must go beyond optics. It must influence policy, culture, and outcomes. And when people who have lived injustice are placed in positions to change it, the result isn't chaos. It's clarity. 6. Systems don't change by themselves, people must challenge them. Malcolm didn't rely on the system to correct itself. He challenged it, with evidence, with courage, and with strategic action. Reform isn't a passive process. It takes pressure, exposure, and often personal sacrifice. If we want to dismantle unjust systems, we can't wait for permission. We must act with conviction. Whether it's through activism, art, policy, or public service, change begins when individuals stop accepting broken structures as normal. This story is a call to action, to question, to investigate, and to disrupt systems that harm under the guise of order. Progress is never convenient, but it is always necessary. 7. You don't have to shout to make history. Malcolm's journey is marked not by outbursts but by presence. He didn't demand attention. He commanded it, through consistency, through clarity, through quiet determination. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice, this story reminds us that change is also made through steady, thoughtful resistance. You don't need to be the most visible person to make an impact. You don't need to go viral to lead. You just need to remain rooted in your values, courageous in your mission, and patient enough to see it through. Greatness often grows in silence, in quiet rooms, in unseen choices, in moments no one records. These 7 moral lessons invite reflection, not just on society but on ourselves. They ask us to consider who we are, what we stand for, and how we use the power we hold, no matter how small, to shape the world around us. They challenge us to move beyond passive belief toward active responsibility. Because justice is not a destination. It is a daily decision. And that's the story of the man they watched. Malcolm Hayes' journey serves as a powerful reminder that the fight for justice and equality is never easy, but it's always worth it. His courage to stand up and speak truth to power shows us that no matter the system, we all have the potential to make a difference. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this story. I hope it has inspired you, made you think, and perhaps even sparked a change in how you see the world. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that challenges and motivates. Be sure to check out the other videos on this channel, where we explore more inspiring stories and life lessons. Your support means the world, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment below. What did you think of Malcolm's story? What lessons stood out to you? Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay inspired, stay motivated.